Mythic rating has certainly been in a better state over the past couple of years than it is currently. And this is kind of this point in time in which Blizzard is probably going to need to make a decision about the future of Mythic rating. Rating in World of Warcraft is probably the pinnacle or the peak content for what the game has been designed around for like the last 20 years. A lot of what the game has been very raid focused. Whenever you think about the best parts of World of Warcraft, you're thinking about some of the raids, you're thinking about Ice Crown Citadel, you're thinking about like Molten Core, you're thinking about Dragon Soul and how much it sucked. But a lot of the stuff and the content that has been making up the fabric of World of Warcraft has been surrounding raids themselves. And as time has gone on, Blizzard has made decisions that have improved the dynamic of how raiding works in World of Warcraft. And I think back going from Mist of Pandaria into Warlords of Draenor, Blizzard made a very important decision, and they unified 25-man and 10-man raiding. They unified it into one 20-player content as the hardest level, because prior to that, it was just Heroic, and Heroic was the equivalent of Mythic in terms of just difficulty, but there was two different amount of players that you could actually zone into the raid with, whether it be 25 players or 10 players. And whenever they unified it, it allowed Blizzard to actually make the fights for an intended amount of people. And not having flexible amounts of people that are required for the fights really allowed Blizzard to hone in on the mechanics and make them well designed for 20 players. And I think that that was actually a very important decision for Blizzard to make. The downside of that is it actually ended up killing a lot of guilds. Guilds that only had 10 players really struggled to actually get up to that 20-player threshold. 25-player guilds, more often than not, were actually fine dropping down to 20, but some of those players got cut and maybe never returned to the game. And so there was actually a big detriment whenever Blizzard made this decision. And so for them, it was actually a pretty scary decision because they could see that potentially killing the game. But it was a move in the right direction for the health of the game, and the invention of Mythic rating, I think, was the correct one for Blizzard. Now, time has gone on. We're about 10 years after that decision was made by Blizzard, going from Mist of Pandaria into Warlords of Draenor. And while I would agree that it was the correct decision at the time, as time has gone on, rating really hasn't changed all too much since that happened 10 years ago. And as a result, rating is doing a lot worse this season than it really has in the past. But the last couple of seasons, it's really been on the downswing. And so we can take a look at some of the numbers from Raider.io. Currently, 954 guilds have killed Mythic Queen Ansarek. If you end up adding all of the guilds that are currently progressing it, you're going to end up having about 1,700-ish guilds that killed it, about 1,650 or so. That's actually pretty low in terms of guilds that get cutting edge. Now, of course, not all guilds get cutting edge. But again, if you look at all of these guilds who are actually participating, it's actually not a lot. A lot of guilds are actually stuck at 4 out of 8. So haven't even killed Brood Twister or Nexus Princess Kaiveza. But this 2,000 number, and you're going to see this in the future, it actually isn't a lot. We don't really have that many participants in the raid this tier compared to where we have in the last couple of tiers. And we're going to kind of loop this into the title of the video, but just give me a second to kind of cook on it. So then we start looking back at some of the previous tiers. You know, Amir Dusul, again, not a ton of participation. We had about the same number of guilds kill Fyrak that you're actually going to have killing Queen Ansarek, which is a little bit weird for the beginning of an expansion. You tend to believe that the beginning of the expansion is going to have the most hype and the most people returning to the game, and more guilds are going to be forming at the very, very beginning of the expansion. But the fact that we're pacing to have about the same number of guilds killing Ansarek as Fyrak is actually very concerning. Then you start looking back to older tiers. We had the first tier of Dragonflight, Vault of the Incarnates. About 2,000 guilds killed Raszagath. Raszagath, not an easy fight, a very difficult encounter. But, I mean, look at this. There's more guilds who are actually participating in the Vault of the Incarnates raid. And so we've kind of seen that drop off over the last year. In addition to that, again, first tier of an expansion, but we've seen a lot of drop off in terms of the amount of participants that are actually dealing with the raid. And then this is way more true the further back you go. You go back to Sanctum of Domination. Sanctum of Domination had 2,000 guilds kill Sylvanas, while a ton more guilds were actively participating in the raid. I mean, look at the amount of 1 out of 10, 3 out of 10, 5 out of 10 guilds. That's, I mean, these are insane numbers. You go back to Castle Nathria. Castle Nathria is one of the most popular raids of all time. They had nearly 2,700 guilds kill Sire Denathrius, and thousands more participated in the raid itself just on Mythic. And so, you know, you had well over, it looks about like 10,000-ish guilds participating in the raid. and which is a crazy number. And then you go back even further, and you are getting even more and more guilds. As you can see here, 2,100 guilds killed Gahoon, but a lot more guilds were actually at this 1 out of 8, 2 out of 8, 3 out of 8 level, where they were, participating in Mythic, but they weren't going to be killing that many bosses. You look at the Nighthold. The Nighthold is actually the most popular raid that I could find on Raider.io. 2,700 guilds ended up killing Gul'dan, while thousands more were actually participating in the raid itself. And so, just over time, as you can see here, Nerebar Palace is a very unpopular raid for guilds that have just gone into the raid. Just not that many guilds have wanted to participate in the raid. And I think it's about time for a change for the landscape of how raiding looks, just in general. And I think, for me, and this is the thing that I would propose, is it's probably about time to bring back 10-man. And I understand that there's going to be big problems with bringing back 10-man, like I talked about earlier. I think it's going to kill a lot of guilds. Going from 20 players to 10 players is a big jump, and so some of those players are going to get cut, and they're likely to be quitting the game, which I think is actually a really bad thing. But I just don't see a path forward for raiding in World of Warcraft that doesn't involve changing Mythic down from 20 players to 10 players, because the population and the amount of people that are participating in Mythic is shrinking every single tier, and it's going to kind of come to a head over the next couple of years where something massive is going to need to change. The reason that I think that 10-man is probably the correct size, first and foremost, it's just going to be a lot easier to get groups. I think that every guild has kind of seen these AOTC guilds that have 16, 17, 18 players, and they always talk about getting into Mythic. When are they going to get into Mythic? They're going to be getting into Mythic soon. Surely we're going to be getting into Mythic next week once we just recruit other people. And those guilds, more likely than not, are never going into Mythic. They're never going to be able to get up to 20 players. But here's the thing. There's going to be guilds that always struggle to get full rosters of recruitment, but it's a lot easier to get 10 players than it is to get 20 players. And there's a lot more of an intimate feeling with 10-man than it would be with 20-man. With 20 players, it's a lot of, these are my guildies. Whereas with 10 players, these are my friends. And I think that it's one of those situations where if you sit there and you think about it, I could reasonably get 9 other people with myself to actually form up a raid. There's no world where I'm actually getting 19 other people to form up a raid. And that allows you to kind of play Mythic raiding at a different way, where it's going to be a lot easier to actually be able to get the people required, because Mythic raiding is so difficult and challenging that it does require people in voice more often than not, and it requires a level of coordination because it's the hardest content in the game, that getting 20 players every single day or a few days a week for is just not really feasible for a lot of these guilds, and it ends up turning into a job and really difficult to play casually in any capacity. And that's why I think that 10 players is going to be the correct amount, because there's going to be a level of bringing back this casual hardcore raid this casual hardcore raider that we kind of see dissolve over the last couple of tiers, and bringing those back into the fray and allowing them to actually jump in and play for themselves. I also think that mechanics just frankly are a little bit too difficult with 20 players. I've been doing the raid testing recently, and it's a situation where the mechanics are cool for 20-man, and I actually like 20-man raiding. I think that it feels a lot of fun, but it's just too hard, I would say. A lot of the mechanics are pass-fail mechanics, because that's the kind of mechanic that you need to design with a 20-man raid. Whereas whenever you go into a 10-man scenario, you're allowed to assign people very specific jobs, and it's going to be less pass-fail in the entire group, less of the Anduin style mechanics that just immediately wipe your raid, less of those style mechanics, and more of the mechanics that you're seeing on screen here, where there's a couple of people that are doing a very specific mechanic or doing a very specific thing, and a lot less just 20-player group coordination. And I think that the mechanics I think are just frankly too difficult with 20 players, and this will allow Blizzard to kind of rein in what the mechanical complexity and the pass-fail nature of the mechanics are, and allow them to become difficult, but difficult in more well-defined ways. And I think that one of those ways that they could actually make mechanics more difficult, especially with 10 players, is DPS checks. I think that DPS checks have largely died over the last couple of tiers, because Blizzard actually has a hard time of gauging and estimating how much damage you're actually going to be able to deal. But with 10 players, you're going to have a smaller band of just what is the top to bottom DPS potential for this entire raid. And I think that will actually be able to allow bringing back more reasonable DPS and HPS checks into the mix. People also will probably bring up the argument in the comment section. Oh, what about class stacking and raid buffs? My proposal for bringing back 10-man, honestly, you could probably just delete raid buffs, and if people are going to class stack, they're going to class stack. I think within reason, you know, most compositions probably should be able to do the raid boss at some point during the raid. Obviously, there's probably going to be some specs that are very good for that tier, maybe even potentially required. But that's just the point of doing Mythic, and I think that, you know, if people are going to class stack, there's only so much class stacking that you can reasonably do with a 10-man raid. I think that raid buffs make it really hard to recruit players just in general, because you're actually lowering the potential pool of players that you would be recruiting from, because you're not actually just recruiting the best available player. You're actually recruiting the best available demon hunter, which then you're reducing the amount of people that can potentially field onto your roster. And so in general, I think that raid buffs over time have actually made it really difficult to actually recruit and continue to maintain guilds because of how that recruitment process ends up working. I would end up just like deleting raid buffs and say to hell with class stacking. If people are going to stack whatever warlocks or whatever, just let them do it. The worst you can have is probably like 3 or 4 like before you can start griefing your raid. Now the final point I think is like the casual hardcore guild. Now the casual hardcore guild has over the last couple of tiers actually died off a lot. Whenever you look back at tiers like Castle Nathri, there were a lot of guilds that were just, you know, casually doing the raid, like, you know, 2 out of 10. Oh, my guild is 6 out of 10, and we were happy with 6 out of 10. Very few guilds actually do this now. You know, you do see a pretty big wall at 4 out of 8. But most guilds are either going to go in and get the loot, the free bosses, and kill the loot pinata bosses, or not progress the raid at all. And in the past, you know, there were guilds that were fine with being 5 out of 10, 6, or you know, 5 out of 8, 6 out of 8, 7 out of 8, and just like happy with the results that they ended up getting. But as time has gone on, I would describe it as the casual hardcore guild has been negatively affected, and it's kind of a landscape of gaming thing, where a lot of people kind of run into this thing where they're like, why try if we're not trying to be the absolute best, or we're not trying to get cutting edge or whatever? And I do kind of understand that thought process and that philosophy, but ultimately it does end up hurting the player base long term by not having these casual hardcore guilds. Because at some point, especially to get players who are capable of getting cutting edge, you have to have people who didn't get cutting edge one season, probably. Like, of course, you can jump straight from nothing into cutting edge, but like very few people do exactly that. And so I think that, you know, kind of helping rebuild the casual hardcore guild, these people who are like, you know, doing mythic raids on their own time just for fun with some of their friends and killing those mythic bosses, you're going to eventually have these people who end up starting to enjoy the progression experience of it all and actually turn into, you know, lifelong raiders and trying to build back up that community. And ultimately, I think that the biggest reason that this needs to change is we need to have a sense of community with raiding again in World of Warcraft. Because right now, I feel like the current trajectory of mythic raiding is not a good one, and one that definitely needs to change. I would propose going back to 10-man, and I think that that's probably the best solution. But there's other things that Blizzard can try. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts down in the comment section below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.